My name is Calhoun, 63 years old, and I never thought my golden years would be spent fighting my own flesh and blood in court. After 42 years working construction, my calloused hands earned every penny of my retirement fund. I raised my only son, Brandon, with everything I had. Last summer, he and his wife, Alexis, invited me to see their new mansion. 1 week later, they handed me mortgage papers for $480,000. If you have ever felt taken advantage of by family, let me know where you are watching from, and hit that subscribe button while I share how I maintained my dignity when my own son tried to rob me of my retirement. I grew up in a small blue-collar town outside Detroit, Michigan. My father worked at the auto plant, and my mother cleaned houses to help make ends meet. We never had much, but they taught me the value of hard work and honesty. Those lessons stuck with me my entire life. I started working when I was 16 years old, taking whatever odd jobs I could find after school and on weekends. Pumping gas, stocking shelves at the local market, mowing lawns in the summer. While my friends were out having fun, I was saving every dollar I could to put myself through community college. By 20, I had earned my associate degree in construction management and landed an entry-level position with a local building company. The hours were long, the work was backbreaking, but I felt proud knowing I was building something real with my hands. It was at a company picnic when I was 24 that I met Margaret. She worked in the office handling payroll, and I fell for her the moment she laughed at my terrible joke about cement mixers. Margaret had this warmth about her, a genuine kindness that made everyone feel special. Her soft brown eyes and gentle smile could brighten even the toughest day on the job site. We married a year later in a simple ceremony at her parents' church. Neither of us wanted anything fancy. We saved our money for a modest starter home instead, a little 2-bedroom ranch that needed plenty of work. I spent our first years of marriage fixing it up on evenings and weekends, transforming it into something we were both proud of. Margaret and I desperately wanted to start a family, but it did not come easy for us. Year after year of trying led to disappointment after disappointment. Doctors' visits, treatments, specialist referrals, all draining our savings and our spirits. When Margaret finally got pregnant at 32, it felt like a miracle. We were going to have a son. The pregnancy was difficult from the beginning. Margaret was sick, constantly developed gestational diabetes, and was put on bed rest for the final 3 months. I would work all day, then come home to cook, clean, and take care of her. When Brandon finally arrived, there were complications during delivery. Margaret needed emergency surgery afterward and spent nearly 2 weeks in the hospital. The medical bills were staggering. I picked up every extra shift I could, working 60, sometimes 70-hour weeks to stay ahead of the debt. Margaret had to quit her job to recover and take care of Brandon. We went from 2 incomes to 1 overnight, but I never complained. This was my family, and providing for them was my responsibility. As Brandon grew, Margaret and I agreed we wanted to give him opportunities we never had. I had been promoted to foreman by then, which helped financially, but private school tuition still stretched our budget to the breaking point. I took side jobs on weekends, installing decks and finishing basements for extra cash. Every penny went toward Brandon's education, or into a college fund for his future. Brandon was a bright kid, curious about everything. He had his mother's gentle eyes and my stubborn determination. We signed him up for every sport and activity. He showed interest in soccer, baseball, piano lessons, science camps. Margaret and I rarely took vacations or bought new things for ourselves. Our priority was always Brandon. When Brandon was 17 and starting to look at colleges, Margaret found a lump in her breast. The diagnosis was devastating stage 3 cancer that had already spread to her lymph nodes. For the next 2 years, our lives revolved around treatments, hospital stays, and brief periods of hope when the cancer seemed to retreat only to return more aggressively. Brandon had been accepted to several good schools, but chose State University partly because of their business program, but mostly to stay close to home during his mother's illness. Even with scholarships, the cost was substantial. I refinanced our house to help cover tuition and took an additional job supervising night shifts at a commercial building project. Margaret fought hard, but she passed away during Brandon's sophomore year of college. The funeral was small, just family and close friends. Brandon was devastated, we both were. I remember him standing by her grave looking so lost. I promised myself I would do whatever it took to make sure he could finish his education and build a good life. It was what Margaret would have wanted. After the funeral, I threw myself into work even harder. 60-hour weeks became my normal routine. My crew worried about me, but the physical exhaustion helped numb the emotional pain. Every night, I would come home to an empty house filled with memories of Margaret. Every morning, I would get up and do it all again. Brandon buried his grief in his studies. His grades improved, and he became focused on a career in finance. I was proud of him for channeling his pain into something productive. When he graduated with honors 3 years later, I sat in the audience fighting back tears. Margaret should have been there to see it. I knew she would have been so proud. With his business degree, Brandon landed a good job at a financial services firm in the city. His starting salary was more than I made after decades in construction. I remembered feeling both pride and a touch of melancholy. My son was already surpassing me just as I had always hoped he would. Brandon met Alexis at work a few years later. She was beautiful, sharp, and confident, working in the marketing department of his firm. The first time he brought her home for dinner, I could see he was completely smitten. Alexis was polished and sophisticated in a way that made me feel a bit rough around the edges in my own home. Still, she was charming and seemed to make Brandon happy, which was all that mattered to me. Their courtship was brief and intense. Within a year, Brandon called to announce they were engaged. I was happy for them, though a small part of me wished Margaret could have met the woman who would become our daughter-in-law. I wondered if she would have seen something in Alexis that I was missing. Even back then, I noticed their lifestyle seemed surprisingly lavish for two young professionals just starting out. Brandon drove a new luxury car. Alexis wore designer clothes and expensive jewelry. When I asked Brandon about it once, he casually mentioned performance bonuses and promising investment opportunities. I did not press the issue, thinking perhaps I was just out of touch with what young professionals earned these days. By the time Brandon and Alexis got engaged, I was approaching 60 and thinking about retirement. My body could not handle the physical demands of construction work much longer. My knees ached constantly, my back gave me trouble, and years of working in all weather conditions had left me with arthritis in my hands. Over the decades, I had managed to build a decent retirement nest egg. Nothing extravagant, but enough to live comfortably if I was careful. I had paid off the mortgage on my house, maximized my company retirement plan, and put away extra whenever possible. My financial advisor assured me I was in good shape to retire at 62 if I maintained my modest lifestyle. My retirement dreams were simple. I wanted to fish more, spend time in my workshop, building furniture, maybe take an occasional road trip to see parts of America I had been too busy working to explore. I did not need fancy restaurants or luxury cruises. Just peace, quiet, and the freedom to spend my days as I chose after a lifetime of punching a clock. When Brandon and Alexis set their wedding date, I offered to contribute what I could to help with expenses. I had been saving a special fund for Brandon's wedding since he was little, something Margaret had insisted on. It was not a fortune, but it was given with all the love in my heart. What I thought would be a nice ceremony with family and close friends quickly spiraled into an extravaganza. They chose an exclusive resort venue that required a minimum guest count of 200 people. The catering alone cost more than my first car. Every detail seemed designed to impress rather than celebrate. My wedding fund covered less than a quarter of the final bill. When Brandon called asking for more money just 2 weeks before the ceremony, I dipped into my savings again. I told myself this was a once-in-a-lifetime event, and Margaret would have wanted our son to have a beautiful wedding. The day itself was certainly beautiful, but felt strangely impersonal. I knew barely a handful of the guests, mostly colleagues from Brandon and Alexis's firm, and her large extended family. I gave my speech, danced one song with a cousin of the bride standing in for the mother-son dance, and spent most of the evening sitting alone at a table feeling like an outsider at my own son's wedding. After returning from a 3-week honeymoon in Europe, Brandon and Alexis settled into married life in a luxury apartment downtown. Each time I visited, there seemed to be new furniture, art pieces, or electronics that had not been there before. When I complimented a particularly nice leather sofa, Alexis casually mentioned it was an Italian designer piece that had been back-ordered for months. Later, I looked up the brand online and was shocked to see similar pieces priced at over $10,000. Our relationship began to shift in subtle ways after the wedding. Brandon used to call me at least once a week, but now weeks would pass without hearing from him. When we did speak, our conversations were shorter, more superficial. He rarely asked about my life anymore, and when I shared stories about my work or friends, he seemed distracted or uninterested. Invitations to their home became less frequent, and when I did visit, there was always an undercurrent of tension. Brandon would look at his watch repeatedly, or Alexis would make comments about needing to meet friends later. I started feeling like an obligation rather than family. The change in Brandon himself was harder to watch. The thoughtful, kind-hearted boy I raised was being replaced by someone increasingly focused on status and appearances. He began making dismissive comments about my clothes, my truck, even my neighborhood. Once, when I mentioned a former coworker who had come on hard times, Brandon remarked that some people just did not work hard enough to succeed. A callousness I had never seen in him before. Alexis's influence seemed obvious to me. She was constantly talking about their friends who were directors, executives, or entrepreneurs. Every story involved exclusive restaurants, luxury vacations, or expensive hobbies. When I mentioned taking a weekend fishing trip to the lake, she wrinkled her nose and said she could never understand why people would choose to sleep outdoors when 5-star hotels existed. Despite the growing distance, I kept trying to maintain our relationship. I invited Brandon for our traditional father-son fishing weekend, something we had done since he was 10. He agreed, then canceled 2 days before citing work commitments. When I suggested rescheduling, he said his schedule was just too unpredictable these days. I tried taking an interest in their lives, asking about Brandon's work projects or Alexis's marketing campaigns, but conversations increasingly circled back to money. They would complain about being broke despite their obvious luxury spending. Once, after Alexis mentioned they were struggling financially, she showed off a new diamond bracelet, explaining it was a necessity for networking events. My attempts to offer fatherly advice were increasingly met with irritation. When I gently suggested they might want to build more savings before taking their second international vacation that year, Brandon snapped that I did not understand how networking and appearances worked in their industry. When I mentioned the benefits of my simple investment strategy that had served me well for decades, Alexis laughed and said those approaches were for people without connections. The Christmas after their first anniversary, they invited me to dinner at their apartment. I brought thoughtful gifts, a handcrafted wooden box for Brandon made in my workshop, and a cashmere scarf for Alexis. They seemed underwhelmed by my presence, setting them aside quickly. Their gift to me was an expensive watch that felt oddly impersonal, still in the store gift box, with the receipt showing a price that made me uncomfortable. Throughout dinner, they talked endlessly about friends who had recently purchased vacation properties, started successful side businesses, or received massive promotions. Alexis mentioned 3 times that her college friend had just moved into a home in an exclusive, gated community. Brandon kept bringing up a coworker who had recently become the youngest vice president in their company's history. As I drove home that night, I felt a heaviness in my chest. It seemed my son was measuring his life against others and finding it wanting, despite having more at his age than I had achieved after decades of work. More troubling was the realization that he seemed to view me as a relic of a bygone era, someone whose advice and experiences had no relevance to his ambitious new life. I began to wonder if Brandon saw me as a person at all anymore, or simply as a potential resource. Our conversations increasingly included casual mentions of their financial goals or investments they were considering. Brandon started asking detailed questions about my retirement savings, framed as concern for my future, but feeling more like an assessment of available funds. When I turned 62 and officially retired, Brandon's reaction was telling. Rather than sharing my excitement about this milestone I had worked toward my entire life, he seemed concerned. He immediately started suggesting financial advisors I should consult, emphasizing the importance of estate planning. There was no congratulations, dinner, no celebration of this chapter of my life closing. Just questions about my will and investments. Last summer, everything came to a head when Brandon called with excitement in his voice. He and Alexis had found their forever home, he said, and wanted me to come see it before they closed the deal. I was touched to be included in such an important decision and agreed to visit that weekend. The address Brandon sent me was in Lakewood Estates, the most exclusive neighborhood in our area. As I drove through the imposing security gates and past sprawling mansions set on manicured lawns, a sense of unease grew in my stomach. This did not seem like a neighborhood where young professionals in their 30s typically bought starter homes. When I pulled up to the address, I sat in my truck for a full minute, certain I had made a mistake. The house before me was not a house at all, but a mansion. 3 stories of stone and glass gleaming in the sunlight, with a circular driveway and a fountain bubbling in the center. Brandon and Alexis stood on the massive front porch, waving excitedly. As soon as I stepped out of my vehicle, Brandon was at my side, slinging an arm around my shoulders. "What do you think, Dad? Pretty impressive, right?" His voice had that eager quality I remembered from when he was a child, showing me his science projects. "It is certainly something," I managed to say, still trying to process what I was seeing. "Brandon, this place looks enormous. And expensive." Alexis appeared beside him, looking radiant in a designer dress that probably cost more than my monthly pension. "Just wait until you see inside," she gushed. "It has everything we have ever dreamed of." The interior tour left me speechless. 6 bedrooms, 7 bathrooms, a home theater, wine cellar, indoor pool, and a kitchen that looked like it belonged in a luxury hotel. Every fixture, every finish screamed money, from the imported Italian marble to the custom-built cabinetry. "The master suite takes up the entire east wing," Alexis explained, leading me through a bedroom larger than my entire first floor. "The closets alone are bigger than our apartment bedroom." She demonstrated the heated floors in the ensuite bathroom and the programmable shower with multiple heads and steam functions. The previous owners were relocating overseas and needed to sell quickly, Brandon explained as we toured the 3-car garage with its built-in storage systems and epoxy floors. "We got it for a steal at $1.2 million. I nearly choked. $1.2 million, Brandon, that is. "A fantastic investment," he finished for me, misinterpreting my shock. "Property in this neighborhood appreciates like crazy. In 5 years, it will probably be worth $2 million. As the tour continued, my mind raced with calculations. Even with their combined salaries, which I estimated were generous but not astronomical, this house would be far beyond their means. The property taxes alone would be staggering, not to mention utilities, maintenance, and the mortgage. "I do not understand how you can afford this," I finally said, as we stood on the back patio overlooking a perfectly landscaped yard, complete with an outdoor kitchen and fire pit. Brandon and Alexis exchanged a quick glance before Brandon answered smoothly. "We have been very smart with investments, and like I said, we got an incredible deal." The conversation over dinner was equally surreal. They described plans for furnishing each room landscaping projects and a pool house they wanted to add eventually. Not once did they mention the practical realities of home ownership, like insurance repairs or the crushing weight of a massive mortgage. When I tried to ask more direct questions about their financing, they deftly changed the subject or gave vague answers about investment returns and future earnings potential. I left that evening with a knot in my stomach, wondering what they were not telling me. A week later, my doorbell rang on a Sunday afternoon. I opened the door to find Brandon and Alexis standing there dressed in what I had come to think of as their business casual best. Brandon held a leather portfolio under one arm. "Dad, sorry to drop by unannounced, but we have some exciting news we wanted to share in person," Brandon said, as they walked in without waiting for an invitation. Alexis immediately began complimenting my home, though her tone carried the faint hint of condescension I had grown used to hearing. "Your place always feels so cozy and lived in," she said, running a finger along my bookshelf. "So many memories here." Brandon suggested we sit at the kitchen table, laying his portfolio in front of him. There was something rehearsed about his posture, the way he cleared his throat before speaking. "Dad, we have been doing a lot of thinking about family and legacy lately." He began, his voice taking on a formal quality I did not recognize. "About what it means to support the next generation and create opportunities for growth." I nodded, unsure where this was heading. "The thing is," he continued, "in life there are moments when families need to come together and invest in their collective future. Mom always talked about how important family was, how we needed to be there for each other." At the mention of Margaret, I felt a flicker of annoyance. Brandon rarely spoke of his mother, and using her memory now felt calculated. Brandon opened the portfolio and slid several documents toward me. "We closed on the house yesterday," he announced with a broad smile. "Congratulations," I said, genuinely happy for them despite my concerns. "That is wonderful news." "The thing is," Brandon continued, his eyes fixed on mine, "we need your help to make this work." Before I could ask what he meant, he slid a thick document across the table. At the top in bold letters was "Mortgage Agreement." I stared at it, uncomprehending. "What is this?" I asked, though a terrible suspicion was already forming. "It is quite simple, Dad," Brandon said, his voice steady and confident. "We need you to take over the mortgage payments. $480,000 total, but broken into manageable monthly payments over 15 years. The room seemed to tilt sideways. "You want me to pay for your house, the one you already bought, without discussing it with me first?" Alexis jumped in, her voice honey-sweet. "Calhoun, we know it sounds surprising at first, but when you think about it, it makes perfect sense. You have saved quite a bit for retirement, and honestly, what else would you do with the money at your age?" "At my age," I repeated, stunned by the casual cruelty of her assessment. Brandon leaned forward, his expression earnest. "Dad, you have saved enough. It is time to help your family. This house will be a legacy somewhere your future grandchildren will grow up. Somewhere you can come for holidays and family gatherings." I stared at my son, trying to reconcile the man before me with the boy I had raised. "Brandon, I worked for over 40 years to save for my retirement. Every extra shift, every weekend job was to secure my future. I already helped pay for your education, your wedding. And we are grateful, he cut in smoothly. But this is different. This is an investment in our family's future. You have, 15, maybe 20 years left. Would you rather spend that time knowing you helped secure your son's future or selfishly hoarding money you cannot possibly spend before you die? The bluntness of his statement felt like a physical blow. I looked down at the mortgage document, still trying to process what was happening. We have already made the down payment, Alexis added. We just need you to commit to the monthly payments. It is really not that much when you think about it, just $4,000 a month. $4,000 a month, I echoed, doing the math quickly. That was nearly double my monthly pension income. You have significant savings, Brandon said dismissively. Your financial advisor told you that you were in great shape for retirement, remember? You mentioned that at Christmas. I felt sick, realizing he had been cataloging my financial disclosures, planning this ambush. Brandon, I cannot afford to pay your mortgage. And even if I could, this is not something I agreed to. His face hardened in a way I had never seen before. I thought you would be happy to help us. After everything Mom and I went through during my childhood, I thought you would want to make things easier for me. What are you talking about? Your mother and I gave you everything we possibly could. Really? His voice took on a bitter edge. What about the times you were working so much I barely saw you? What about having to wear second-hand clothes in middle school because you said new ones were too expensive? What about the therapy I needed after Mom died, that you were too busy working to notice I needed? Each accusation felt like a knife twisting in my heart. I had worked those long hours to provide for them. We had bought clothes when needed, though, yes, sometimes from thrift stores to save for his education. And I had arranged grief counseling for both of us after Margaret passed, which Brandon had attended for 6 months. I did the best I could as your father, I said quietly. I worked hard to give you opportunities to put you through college without student loans, to help you start your adult life without debt. And now you have a chance to truly make a difference in my life, Brandon countered. To give me the security you never provided emotionally by at least providing it financially. Alexis placed her hand over mine, her touch feeling intrusive rather than comforting. Calhoun, if you really love Brandon, you will sign these papers. It is what any father who truly cares about his child would do. In that moment, clarity washed over me. This was not about family or legacy or love. This was about entitlement and manipulation. My son and his wife had made a reckless financial decision and expected me to bear the consequences. No, I said firmly, pushing the papers away. I will not sign these. I will not pay for a house you purchased without consulting me. This is your responsibility, not mine. The change in their demeanor was immediate and shocking. Brandon's face flushed with anger, his jaw clenching. I knew you would do this. You have always been selfish. Selfish? I could barely comprehend the accusation. I gave you everything I could your entire life. Obviously not everything, Alexis snapped, dropping all pretense of warmth. You are sitting on a pile of money while your only son is asking for help. Help would have been discussing this before you bought $1 million house. I replied, my own anger rising. Help would be me contributing to a reasonable down payment on a starter home, not taking on a mortgage that would bankrupt me. Brandon stood abruptly, gathering the papers with jerky movements. You will regret this decision, Dad. I promise you that. Are you threatening me? I asked in disbelief. I am stating a fact, he replied coldly. Family helps family. If you will not help us, do not expect us to consider you family anymore. Alexis was already heading for the door. Come on, Brandon. I told you this was a waste of time. He has never really cared about you." The cruelty of her statement left me speechless. This woman who had known me for a few years presumed to judge my entire relationship with my son. Brandon paused at the door. "This was your chance to do the right thing, to make up for all the ways you failed as a father. I guess some people never change." And with that parting shot, they were gone, leaving me sitting alone at my kitchen table, feeling as though I had just been hit by a truck. The week following Brandon and Alexis's ambush was one of the most difficult of my life. My phone buzzed constantly, with aggressive text messages and voicemails from both of them. Brandon's tone shifted between anger and guilt, inducing reminders of his childhood needs I had supposedly neglected. Alexis took a more direct approach, sending messages like, "A real father would sacrifice everything for his child," and "Your selfishness is destroying this family." I tried not to engage, responding only once to suggest we meet and talk calmly when emotions were not running so high. Brandon's response was a single line, "You will regret this decision." Then came the calls from extended family and old friends. Brandon had apparently been busy contacting everyone in our shared circle, telling his version of events. My brother called from Florida, concerned that I was abandoning Brandon when he needs help. My cousin asked why I was being so stingy when family needs support. A former coworker texted to say he was disappointed to hear I was turning my back on my only son. Each conversation required me to defend myself, to explain that I had not agreed to pay for a mansion before it was purchased. Some understood after hearing my side. Others seemed to think that as a parent, I was obligated to give Brandon whatever he asked for, regardless of the circumstances or cost. After 10 days of this emotional battering, I reached out to Brandon and suggested we meet for lunch, just the two of us. To my surprise, he agreed, suggesting an upscale restaurant downtown. I arrived early, hoping for a calm, rational conversation where we could find some middle ground. Brandon arrived 20 minutes late, but he was not alone. A sharp-featured man in an expensive suit accompanied him, carrying a leather briefcase. Brandon made no apology for his tardiness or for bringing an unexpected guest. "Dad, this is Jeffrey Winters," he said coolly. "Jeff is a friend who happens to be an attorney. I asked him to join us just to help facilitate our conversation." I felt ambushed once again. I thought we were having a private father-son lunch to work things out. The attorney gave me a practiced smile. "Mr. Calhoun, I am just here to make sure the conversation stays productive. Brandon values your relationship and wants to find an amicable solution to this unfortunate situation." "There is no situation," I replied firmly. "Brandon and Alexis purchased a home they cannot afford and expect me to pay for it. I never agreed to this arrangement." Brandon's expression hardened. "That is not true, Dad. You promised to help us buy a house. We have discussed it multiple times over the past few years." I stared at him in disbelief. "Brandon, that is simply not true. I never made any such promise." Jeffrey Winters opened his briefcase and removed a folder. "Mr. Calhoun, we have documented several instances where you verbally committed to financial assistance for Brandon and Alexis's home purchase." He slid papers across the table, including what appeared to be a typed timeline of conversations with dates and alleged quotes from me. According to this document, I had been promising financial support for their home purchase for years, including specific references to amounts similar to the mortgage they now expected me to pay. "These are fabrications," I said, pushing the papers back. "I never had these conversations. I never made these promises." Brandon's face flushed with anger. "Stop lying, Dad. You told us at Christmas 2 years ago that you had been setting aside money to help us buy our first home. You said it again at my birthday dinner last year." What he was describing had never happened. At Christmas 2 years ago, I had given Brandon and Alexis gift cards to a home goods store with a note about hoping they would find a nice home someday. At his birthday dinner, we had barely discussed personal matters at all. "Brandon," I said quietly, "you know this is not true. I never promised to buy you a house." Jeffrey Winters interjected smoothly. "Mr. Calhoun, verbal contracts are binding in this state. If you made promises that Brandon and Alexis relied upon to their detriment, you could be legally obligated to fulfill those promises." The implicit threat was clear. Brandon met my gaze, a challenge in his eyes. "I did not want it to come to this, Dad, but you have left us no choice. We bought that house because you promised to help. Now we will lose everything if you go back on your word." I stood up from the table, suddenly unable to continue this farce. "I never made those promises, Brandon. I think we both know that. I am sorry you are in a difficult financial situation, but I will not be manipulated or threatened." "This is not a threat," the lawyer said calmly. "This is simply a statement of legal reality." I looked at my son, searching for any sign of the boy I had raised. "Brandon, is this really what you want, to fabricate stories and threaten legal action against your own father?" "What I want is for you to keep your word," he replied coldly. But clearly, that was expecting too much. I left the restaurant with a heavy heart, but also a growing resolve. If Brandon was willing to lie and manipulate to this degree, I needed to protect myself. 3 days later, a courier delivered an envelope to my door. Inside were legal papers informing me that Brandon and Alexis were suing me for $480,000 for breach of verbal contract, plus additional damages for emotional distress and financial hardship they claimed to be suffering as a result of my broken promises. The total claim was nearly $700,000, an amount that would completely wipe out my retirement savings and leave me destitute. I sat at my kitchen table, the same one where Margaret and I had helped Brandon with his homework, where we had celebrated birthdays and holidays, where we had shared thousands of family meals. Now my only child was trying to take everything I had worked for my entire life. That afternoon, I called a lawyer of my own. The retainer alone was $2,000, money I had been saving for a fishing trip to Alaska I had dreamed about for years. Instead, it would go toward defending myself against my own son. The weeks that followed were a nightmare. I barely slept, lost weight, and found myself jumping whenever my phone rang. My blood pressure spiked so severely that my doctor put me on medication and warned me about the effects of chronic stress on heart health. Friends tried to be supportive, but many suggested I should just pay what Brandon wanted to make the problem go away. "Is your retirement savings really worth losing your relationship with your son?" my neighbor Frank asked one evening. But it was not just about the money anymore. It was about the shocking betrayal, the willingness of my own child to lie and manipulate to get what he wanted. If I gave in now, what would stop him from coming back for more later? Where would it end? Meanwhile, Brandon and Alexis had taken their campaign public. Alexis posted thinly veiled comments on social media about toxic parents who hoard wealth while their children struggle. Brandon told mutual acquaintances I had become confused and forgetful since retirement, implying I had forgotten promises I had made. The isolation was perhaps the hardest part. Each day brought new evidence that people I had known for years were choosing sides, and many were believing Brandon's version of events. I found myself avoiding the grocery store, the barbershop, even my regular coffee shop, to prevent uncomfortable encounters. In my darkest moments, I wondered if giving Brandon the money would be worth it just to end the nightmare. But a stubborn part of me, the part shaped by decades of honest work and sacrifice, refused to surrender to such blatant manipulation. Margaret would never have wanted me to reward such behavior, even from our beloved son. The case progressed slowly through preliminary legal steps. My attorney, Sarah Harrington, was thorough and compassionate, but also realistic about the challenges we faced. Even though their claims are fabricated, she explained during one of our meetings, verbal contract cases can be difficult. It often comes down to credibility and supporting evidence. We need to start building our defense aggressively. Sarah began by investigating Brandon and Alexis's financial situation, filing discovery motions to compel disclosure of relevant documents. What she uncovered shocked even her. Calhoun, she said during a meeting about 6 weeks into the case, their financial records tell a very different story than the one they are presenting in court. She spread documents across her desk, pointing out key figures. Brandon and Alexis were carrying over $300,000 in debt even before purchasing the house. Credit card statements showed regular charges at high-end restaurants, luxury retailers, and exclusive vacation destinations. In the previous year alone, they had taken 3 international trips, staying at 5-star resorts and spending lavishly. They applied for conventional mortgages at 6 different banks, Sarah continued. All 6 rejected their application due to their debt-to-income ratio and credit history. The mortgage they eventually obtained is from a high-risk lender with an interest rate nearly double the market average. Most troubling was evidence that they had taken out a personal loan at an exorbitant interest rate to make the down payment on the house. According to the loan application, they had listed expected family gifts as a source of upcoming income to repay the loan. They were counting on your money before they ever asked for it, Sarah said grimly. As we dug deeper, we discovered something even more disturbing. Sarah had subpoenaed records from Brandon's bank and found evidence that he had attempted to use my information on loan applications in the past. There were multiple declined credit inquiries where my name had been listed as a co-applicant, something I had never authorized. This is beyond a civil matter, Sarah said, her expression grave. This crosses into potential fraud. I felt physically ill learning how far my son had gone. The evidence suggested this was not a one-time desperate measure, but a pattern of behavior, a calculated plan to use my financial resources without my knowledge or consent. What do we do now? I asked, still struggling to process the magnitude of the betrayal. We countersue, Sarah replied firmly, for defamation, fraudulent misrepresentation, and emotional distress. They need to understand that their actions have consequences. I hesitated the thought of actively taking legal action against Brandon, still feeling wrong on some fundamental level. He is still my son. I understand, Sarah said gently, but sometimes the most loving thing we can do for our children is to hold them accountable. If Brandon faces no consequences for this behavior, what lesson does he learn? As I considered her words, my office phone rang. Sarah's assistant informed us that someone named Thomas Rayburn was in the lobby insisting on speaking with me about Brandon's case. The name was familiar, but it took me a moment to place it. Brandon's college roommate, I realized aloud. They lived together for 3 years. Thomas was shown into the office looking uncomfortable but determined. He was a stocky man with kind eyes and a firm handshake. "Mr. Calhoun," he said, "I am sorry to intrude, but I saw an article in the local business journal about this lawsuit. I felt I needed to come forward." He explained that he and Brandon had remained friends after college, though they had drifted apart in recent years. The last time we got together was about 2 years ago for drinks after work. Brandon had a lot to drink that night and started talking about his financial plans. Thomas shifted uncomfortably before continuing. He bragged about how he was setting things up to, in his words, get his old man to pay for everything. He specifically mentioned a house, saying you had plenty of money saved up, and it was his inheritance anyway, so why should he wait until you were dead to use it? I felt the blood drain from my face. He said that 2 years ago. Thomas nodded grimly. I thought he was just drunk and talking nonsense. When I called him on it, saying it sounded pretty manipulative, he laughed it off. But seeing this lawsuit now, I realized he was serious. I could not stay silent. He agreed to provide a sworn statement about the conversation. As he left, he paused at the door. Mr. Calhoun, for what it is worth, Brandon was always talking about how hard you worked to give him opportunities. Whatever has changed him, I wanted you to know that. His words provided small comfort, but they did remind me of something. After returning home, I went to the attic and found the box of Margaret's personal items I had preserved after her death. Among them were her journals, dozens of them spanning our married life. I had never read them, feeling they were her private thoughts. But now, searching for understanding, I carefully opened the one from Brandon's high school years. Margaret's elegant handwriting filled the pages with observations about our daily life, her illness, and her concerns for Brandon's future. Several entries caught my attention. Worried about B's attitude toward money lately. Asked for expensive sneakers again today, got angry when C suggested saving up from his allowance. Said all his friends' parents just buy things when asked. Need to talk with him about values. Another entry dated several months later. B brought home C's credit card statement, upset about being told no for spring break trip to Florida. Had actually opened the envelope without permission to see if they could afford it. Very concerned about this behavior. C too tired from work to address it properly. And most painfully, an entry from her final year. C works so hard for this family. B seems to take it all for granted. Today he complained about the car we helped him buy for college, saying it was embarrassing compared to what other students drive. I worry what will happen when I am gone. Will he appreciate his father's sacrifices, or just keep demanding more? Margaret had seen warning signs I had missed or chosen to ignore. In my desire to give Brandon everything to compensate for the loss of his mother, perhaps I had enabled the very entitlement that now threatened to destroy our relationship. The next day, I called Sarah and told her to proceed with the countersuit. It was time for Brandon to face the consequences of his actions, not just for my sake, but for his own. 3 months after Brandon and Alexis filed their lawsuit, we met for court-ordered mediation. The process required both parties to attempt resolution before proceeding to trial, with a retired judge serving as mediator. I arrived with Sarah feeling a strange calm after months of emotional turmoil. Brandon and Alexis entered the conference room minutes later, both dressed impeccably. Alexis wore a conservative dress that probably cost more than my entire wardrobe, while Brandon's suit looked custom-tailored. Their attorney, Jeffrey Winters, carried an expensive leather portfolio and exuded confidence. "This should be straightforward," he began once we were all seated. "My clients have a clear claim of verbal contract and detrimental reliance. They purchased a home based on Mr. Calhoun's repeated promises of financial support. We believe a full settlement of the mortgage amount plus compensation for emotional distress would be appropriate." Sarah smiled politely. "Before we discuss settlement terms, we have some evidence to present that significantly impacts this case." She proceeded to methodically lay out what we had discovered: Brandon and Alexis's massive pre-existing debt, the rejected mortgage applications, the high-interest loan for the down payment, and most damaging, the evidence of Brandon's previous unauthorized use of my information on loan applications. As she presented each document, I watched the confidence drain from Brandon's face. He leaned over to whisper urgently to his lawyer, who appeared increasingly concerned. Most powerful was Thomas's sworn statement, which Sarah read aloud. Brandon's face flushed with anger when he heard his former friend's name. Alexis gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white. "Given these findings," Sarah concluded, We have filed a countersuit for defamation, fraudulent misrepresentation, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. We are prepared to pursue criminal charges regarding the unauthorized use of my client's personal information if this matter is not resolved appropriately. Jeffrey Winters requested a break to confer with his clients. As they huddled in the corner of the room, their whispered conversation grew heated. I could see Alexis gesturing angrily, while Brandon's shoulders slumped progressively lower. When they returned to the table, Jeffrey's tone had changed dramatically. In light of the evidence presented, my clients would be willing to withdraw their claim if Mr. Calhoun agrees to withdraw his countersuit. Sarah shook her head. My client has suffered significant damages both financially and emotionally. We will require reimbursement of all legal fees at minimum. The mediator, who had been silent until this point, spoke up. I must advise that the evidence presented raises serious concerns about the validity of the original claim. If this proceeds to trial, there could be more severe consequences than just legal fees. As the negotiations continued, Brandon attempted to make eye contact with me several times. During another break, he approached me while our lawyers were speaking with the mediator. "Dad," he said quietly, "we need to talk privately. We can work this out between us." "I think we are beyond that point, Brandon," I replied, keeping my voice steady despite the ache in my chest. "We will let the court decide now." "You would really do this to your own son?" he asked, an edge of desperation in his voice. "You did this, Brandon, not me. I never wanted any of this." Before he could respond, the lawyers returned and Brandon retreated to his seat. After another hour of negotiations, a settlement was reached. They would withdraw their lawsuit, pay my legal fees in full, and sign a legally binding statement acknowledging that I had never promised to pay for their house. The mediator explained that this was the best outcome for all parties. Going to trial would likely result in not just financial penalties for Brandon and Alexis, but potential damage to their professional reputations and careers. Brandon signed the agreement without meeting my eyes. Alexis stared at me with unconcealed hostility as she added her signature to the document. Neither spoke to me as they left the room. 2 weeks later, my lawyer called with news. "Brandon and Alexis have listed their house for sale," she told me. "Apparently, they cannot make the mortgage payments, and the lender has threatened foreclosure." I felt no satisfaction at this news, only sadness. My son had created this situation through his own choices, but I took no pleasure in his difficulties. The case was officially dismissed the following month. The judge reviewed our settlement agreement and added a stern warning that any further false claims could result in sanctions. As I left the courthouse, I felt relief mixed with profound loss. I had won the legal battle but lost my relationship with my only child. That evening, my phone rang with Brandon's number on the caller ID. I hesitated before answering, unsure what more could be said between us. "Dad," his voice sounded different, smaller somehow. I need to talk to you. About everything." "Dad, I know I have no right to ask you for anything." Brandon began, his voice breaking slightly over the phone. "But we are in serious trouble. The bank is foreclosing, we cannot make the payments, and everything is falling apart." Despite everything that had happened, hearing the desperation in my son's voice triggered that instinctive parental concern. But I had learned my lesson about enabling his behavior. "I am sorry to hear that, Brandon. What are you planning to do?" "That is why I am calling," he admitted. "We need help. Not money," he added quickly, "but advice. You always were good at figuring out practical solutions." We agreed to meet at a neutral location, a coffee shop halfway between our homes. When Brandon arrived, I barely recognized him. Gone was the polished, confident executive. The man who slid into the booth across from me looked exhausted. His expensive clothes wrinkled dark circles under his eyes. Thank you for meeting me, he said, not quite meeting my gaze. What is going on, Brandon? I asked directly. He took a deep breath and began outlining their situation. The monthly mortgage payments were impossible to maintain. They had already missed two, and the bank was threatening foreclosure. Their high-interest loan for the down payment had ballooned with penalties. Credit card companies were calling daily about missed minimum payments. We have to sell the house, he concluded. But the real estate market has slowed, and our asking price is not generating interest. The agent says we need to drop it significantly, which means we will lose money on the sale. I listened without interrupting, noting that for the first time in years, Brandon was speaking honestly about their finances, rather than maintaining the illusion of success. Where is Alexis in all this? I asked. Brandon's expression darkened. She is not handling it well. Blames me for not pushing harder with the lawsuit, blames you for not helping us, blames everyone but herself. We are fighting constantly. After considering his situation, I offered a structured path forward. You need to be realistic about what you can afford. Sell the house as quickly as possible, even at a loss, to stop the bleeding. Find a modest apartment within your actual budget. Create a repayment plan for the debt you can manage. Get financial counseling. Brandon nodded slowly. I know you are right. I just do not know how to make Alexis understand. She keeps saying something will work out, that we deserve that lifestyle. Brandon, I said gently, no one deserves anything they have not earned. That was a lesson your mother and I tried to teach you. We worked for everything we had. For the first time, he seemed to really hear me. I know, I just got caught up in everything. The status, the appearances. Somewhere along the way, I started believing we needed all those things to be happy. I did not offer financial assistance that day, but I did give him the name of a reputable financial counselor and a real estate agent who specialized in quick sales. It was a small step, but perhaps the beginning of a different kind of relationship, one based on honest communication rather than manipulation. Over the next few months, Brandon's situation progressed much as I had anticipated. They sold the house at a significant loss, using the proceeds to pay off the highest interest debts. They moved into a 2-bedroom apartment in a modest neighborhood. Brandon took a second job on weekends to help address the remaining debt. Alexis did not adjust well to their changed circumstances. According to Brandon, she became increasingly bitter, blaming him for their financial troubles and refusing to modify her spending habits. 6 months after they moved into the apartment, she left, filing for divorce shortly thereafter. Brandon called me the night she left, sounding more defeated than I had ever heard him. She said she did not sign up for this kind of life, he told me, his voice hollow. Said she deserved better than struggling to pay bills and shopping at discount stores. I am sorry, son, I said, and I meant it. Despite everything, I never wanted to see him in pain. The thing is, Dad, he continued after a long pause, I think I am actually relieved. These past months have been so stressful, constantly trying to please someone who is never satisfied. I am exhausted. That conversation marked a turning point in our healing process. Brandon began to see more clearly how Alexis had influenced his values and behavior, though I was careful never to criticize her directly. He needed to reach his own conclusions. For my part, I had been doing my own healing work. I joined a support group for parents with estranged adult children, finding comfort in sharing experiences with others who understood the unique pain of that situation. I made new friends, people who valued me for my character, rather than what I could provide materially. I discovered a new purpose in volunteering at a community center, teaching basic carpentry skills to young people. Working with teenagers who were eager to learn practical skills reminded me of Brandon at that age, before money and status became his focus. Brandon and I began meeting monthly for coffee, our conversations gradually becoming less strained. We avoided discussing the lawsuit, directly focusing instead on rebuilding some foundation of trust. About a year after the court case was dismissed, Brandon asked if he could come over for dinner. It was the first time he had been to my home since the day he and Alexis had presented the mortgage documents. He arrived with a bottle of inexpensive wine and a homemade casserole. "I have been learning to cook," he explained somewhat sheepishly. "Turns out, eating at home saves a ton of money." After dinner, as we sat in the living room, Brandon finally addressed what had happened between us. "Dad, I need to apologize properly," he said, his voice steady but vulnerable. "What I did was inexcusable. I lied to you, tried to manipulate you, and then tried to punish you when you did not give me what I wanted." I listened without interrupting as he continued. "I got caught up in a lifestyle I could not afford and started seeing you as a solution to my problems rather than as my father. I forgot everything you and Mom taught me about honesty and hard work. I am truly sorry for the pain I caused you." His apology felt genuine without the calculated quality his words had taken on in recent years. "Thank you, Brandon," I said simply. "That means a lot to me. I do not expect things to go back to how they were before," he added. "I know I damaged our relationship in ways that might never fully heal, but I hope we can move forward somehow." We did move forward cautiously at first. I forgave Brandon not because he deserved it, but because holding on to anger was only hurting me. However, forgiveness did not mean forgetting or removing all consequences. Our relationship had changed permanently, and we both needed to acknowledge that reality. I established clear boundaries, making it known that financial discussions were off limits for the foreseeable future. Brandon respected this, never asking for money or hinting at financial troubles, even when I knew he was struggling to rebuild his credit and pay off remaining debts. Gradually, a new relationship emerged, more honest, if less idealized than before. Brandon returned to the values Margaret and I had tried to instill in him, living within his means and finding satisfaction in simpler pleasures. He eventually met someone new, a kindergarten teacher named Diane, who shared his renewed appreciation for financial responsibility. For my part, I gained a deeper understanding of how my own behavior had contributed to the situation. In my desire to give Brandon everything I had, inadvertently helped create the entitlement that nearly destroyed our relationship. Sometimes loving our children means allowing them to face the consequences of their choices. The experience taught me that dignity cannot be taken, only surrendered. By standing firm in my truth, despite the pain and isolation, I maintained my self-respect. By establishing boundaries even with those we love most, we honor ourselves and ultimately create healthier relationships. Now, 3 years after that terrible summer, when my son sued me, I can look back with perspective rather than pain. Brandon and I have a relationship based on mutual respect rather than financial dependency. He is building a life aligned with his actual values rather than projected image. And I am enjoying my retirement, as I always planned, fishing, woodworking, and occasionally traveling, secure in the knowledge that I stayed true to myself, even when it was most difficult. The experience changed me, but it did not break me. And in that resilience, I found a peace I never expected to discover through such a painful journey. If you have ever had to stand your ground with family, even when it broke your heart to do so, let me know in the comments. Was there a moment you had to choose your own dignity over someone else's demands? Hit the like button if this story resonated with you. Subscribe for more stories about finding strength in difficult situations, and share this video with someone who might need to hear that setting boundaries with family is sometimes the most loving thing you can do. Thank you for listening, and remember, your self-respect is never a selfish choice.